Hello, today I'm going to tell you the story called Tony's Bread, written by Tommy DiPaolo. Once upon a time, in a small village just outside Milano, Italy, lived a little baker named Antonio. He was a small-time baker who owned a small bakery that only made simple bread, but the villagers all loved it for its simplicity. However, Tony had a dream that one day he would be the most famous baker in all of northern Italy. Tony also had a daughter. Her name was Serafina. Tony had raised Serafina since the time she was a little girl, but he was a widower, so he had given her everything that she wanted. The three sisters who sat just inside the city square and watched Serafina since she was a little girl commented saying that Serafina had everything she wanted as long as she asked Tony. She had the finest clothes, the finest jewelry. She didn't even have to lift a finger if she hadn't need to. However, because Tony had raised her all on his own, he also believed that his daughter deserved the very best, including men. Therefore, no man was worthy enough to marry his young Serafina. This made Serafina very sad. She sat at her window every day eating her dolci, which in Italian means sweets. She sat there and she cried because all she wanted was to find the love of her life. Well, one day that would change. As Serafina was sitting in her window eating her dolci a few days later, a wealthy nobleman from Milano named Angelo happened to walk by. Just as Angelo was passing Serafina and Tony's house, the curtains blew away from Serafina's window, and he saw her beautiful face. It was love at first sight for both of them. Angelo noticed that the three sisters, Zia Clorinda, Zia Clotilda, and Zia Caterina, were just nearby, as they always were. He wandered over to ask them all about Serafina. He commented on her beauty and asked, "Is she married, or is she spoken for?" The three sisters commented that she was not married. However, Tony, her father, would not be okay with any suitor who wanted to court Serafina. Angelo decided to heck with that. He would find out everything he could about Serafina and Tony in order to hatch his own little plan. So Angelo asked several questions of the three sisters and ended the conversation with a grazie. With his new plan, he insisted that the sisters help him carry out this plan. And the next day, a letter arrived for Tony. The letter introduced Angelo as a man of Milano. Angelo stated that he loved Tony's bread and that there was nothing like it in all of Milano. He said that he had a proposal for Tony and would love to meet him after Mass the next day. However, along with that letter, a secret letter was sent to Serafina professing Angelo's great love for her and that she would one day be his wife. The next day, the three sisters began their part before Tony went to meet Angelo. They stopped by his bakery and told Tony about this fine nobleman they ran into and how greatly he thought of Tony's bread. Tony commented to the sisters, saying that was very strange indeed, because he had received a letter from a nobleman named Angelo and was on his way to meet him after Mass. Angelo later that day after Mass met up with Tony and Serafina. He invited them to Milano, saying that he would set Tony up in his own famous fine bakery in the Piazza del Duomo, which was the cathedral square. Angelo insisted that Tony bring Serafina along, telling Tony that he finally admitted to wanting her to be his wife one day. So with that, Tony decided to pack up his things, including Serafina, and off to Milano they went. They spent the entire day tasting fine pastries from all the finest bakeries. Tony started to feel depressed after all this tasting, saying that his bread just could not compare to any of the fancy bread here in Milano. Angelo and Serafina were heartbroken. They couldn't possibly let Tony leave, Serafina wanted so badly to stay in the city as she loved it, and to stay with Angelo, her newfound love. So, as they sat there and tried to think of ways to help Tony stay, Serafina munched on her dolce as she always did when she was sad. And just then, she got an idea. Father, what if your bread could just taste as good as these candied fruits? Well, Tony thought about it for a little bit, but it just wasn't quite the answer. So Angelo began to think. As he sipped his fruit punch, he started to think, Tony, what if you could make a bread that was as rich as this punch, but with the finest milk and the finest eggs and the finest honey? Tony decided to think a little bit more, and all of a sudden, Tony, Serafina, and Angelo all decided, that's it. Tony would combine all of the ingredients, candied fruit and raisins, which were both Serafina's favorites, as well as the finest milk, the finest eggs, and the finest honey, at Angelo's suggestion. So, Angelo bought Tony all the supplies he would need to make his first batch of this brand new ingredient-based bread. Angelo sent Tony on his way with all the supplies back to his own bakery, and off Tony got to baking. He baked all day and all night and covered all the dough so it would rise. The next morning, Tony put all that raised dough into different pots and pans so that it could all bake so that Angelo could taste it later that day. But he had so much dough, he had to use the rest of it in a flower pot to cook. Just as the bread was finishing baking, Angelo showed up just in time. Soon enough, the three sisters came along as well because they wanted a taste of Tony's new bread. They all waited very patiently as Tony cut a new slice of this fresh bread. Serafina tasted the bread and she loved it. Next, Angelo tasted the bread. He loved it as well. Tony tasted the bread and he loved it, but it was his bread, so he had to let the three sisters taste. They loved it and they fell in love with it as well. Angelo said, Tony, I will take the rest of this bread back to Milano, and all my friends and noblemen shall taste it, and we will see what they say. Sure enough, a few days later, Tony received a new shipment of supplies to make more of his soon-to-be famous bread. He started baking, and then he noticed the bottom of the Angelo's letter, which said, be sure to bake all of the bread in flower pots, because that was the shape my friends loved the best. Soon enough, Angelo sent a coach to get Serafina and Tony just before Christmas. Serafina and Tony loaded up all their baked bread and all the rest of their supplies, and off they went to Milano, Italy. There they were greeted by the bishop and the mayor, who said they were pleased to have Tony and all of the finest bread so that they would never have to run out of the most amazing bread they had ever tasted. The next morning when the bakery opened, Serafina and Angelo could hear all the cheers of the crowds in Italy waiting for the bakery to be opened. However, Serafina and Angelo were at a chapel next door, getting married secretly, but they could hear the excitement in everyone's voices as they waited for the bakery to open that day. And as the bakery opened, crowds cheered for Panettone, which meant in Italian, Tony's bread. And to this day, that bread is known around Christmas time as Panettone, or in America, what we know it as fruitcake. And from then, Panettone was the most famous bread in Milano, Italy, just as Tony had always hoped.